Alright, now when you want to talk Final Fantasy, it's kind of impossible to ignore the circumstances around its birth. Squaresoft, the company who'd made several mediocre titles at best, was getting ready to go out of business, so they decided to gamble everything on not quite copying, but adapting the formula of the massively successful Dragon Quest into an RPG of their own. And that became Final Fantasy. Now, this is interesting for a lot of reasons because the game was experimenting with something that had been established. Dragon Quest had a very set formula where you would attack monsters, but you didn't see the attacks happening. It was a black screen behind you, or sometimes not a screen at all. And it was very much like a text adventure with some representations on the screen to show you what was happening. For example, when you were moving around a town. Final Fantasy tried to one-up that. In battle, all the characters would move when they attacked. If they cast a spell, you would see an animation. This was, for the time, revolutionary. It really pushed the limits of the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Famicom in Japan. It showed that a game didn't have to be static, especially an RPG, where you are mostly just grinding to progress. It could be dynamic. You could have effects that gave players a feeling of things actually happening, of them having control over the situation. This is why I think the first Final Fantasy took off initially. However, that's not to say it didn't have a huge number of flaws. For starters, there's virtually no characterization of anybody. All of your characters are blank slates, and all of the people you meet are standard fantasy tropes. That being said, there are some interesting things they do with this. Mostly it's building on tropes of a fantasy world and then defying them. A perfect example of this is the airship moment, when you find an airship buried in the sand after going through several, standard fantasy fairs, where you're crawling through dungeons, fighting dark elves, mind flayers, the like. All of a sudden, you are transported into the sky. You have incredible freedom of movement, and you go to a tower of technology to hunt your final foe. Well, before the secret final boss, who's no longer a secret. Anyway, this was very interesting at the time because it showed that Square was willing to experiment, take something established like the Dragon Quest standard fantasy formula, and do something new with it. These days, Final Fantasy the original is incredibly clunky. Even with the updated versions on the PlayStation 1, it feels very archaic with the turn-based system. You select stuff to do, and then you and your enemies will act it out. It's very slow and methodical, and the spell system is incredibly weak, as you can't regain spells once you've used them. You can only rest at an inn to get them back. And you have to buy all your spells, and spells are limited to classes. But that being said, it did do some very good things. The world building is excellent. You have several distinct kingdoms and societies. You have different ways of getting around the world. I talked about the airship, but you also have a regular ship. And probably the most relevant part of the game today is the music. Nobuo Uematsu's score is amazing. It is one of the most iconic in all of video gaming, and with good reason. It's not quite as evocative as his later scores, but it puts you in the right mood for an adventure. It gets you feeling what players who are on a quest might feel like. Now, I've said the story is weak, but I gotta give credit to Square for trying something interesting with it. The very end of the game, there is a massive plot twist, and a sort of Chekhov's gun moment where something you've been given at the start comes into play. And it's pretty interesting. It's a little nonsensical, I will say that. But it's very interesting what they do with it. They create basically a time paradox where someone you fought earlier, who you thought defeated, actually has a much bigger role. Granted, this is not expanded upon nearly enough in either the original or the remakes to really save the game, but when you look back at it, it's kind of interesting to see what they were thinking. Now, does this game stand up enough to be played today? I would say it kind of does. One thing I haven't talked about is the class system, because everyone's kind of imitated it from this Final Fantasy. The original Final Fantasy allowed you to select from a number of classes, and even more shockingly, those classes could evolve later in the game, get stronger, have new abilities. perhaps the most dynamic being the Thief, who went from a relatively weak melee fighter to not only a strong melee fighter, but a spellcaster. You would have characters gaining access to new spells, or just getting a basic stat boost. But more than that, they also got an upgrade in their images. The sprites changed if you got stronger. This was huge at the time. And I think it's one of the reasons that Final Fantasy caught so many people's attention. It's because not only was it very different from Dragon Quest and more engaging visually, but it did a lot of firsts. This became kind of irrelevant later as more and more people were experimenting and copying the formula. A perfect example of this is the game Last Dream on Steam. It does everything Final Fantasy does except better, but without the evocative music score, and so when I say it does everything better, that doesn't always mean huge leaps. You have a lot of classes to choose from, for example, but the story is still relatively mediocre. And without a strong musical score, it's kind of boring. To me. But, it's an interesting experience. Anyway, back to Final Fantasy. It's a game that is a time capsule of the beginnings of the standard JRPG, because it was a departure from the typical Western RPGs that had been played on computers at the time, where you build your class from scratch and go in dungeons first person style, and there's a story, but you kind of make it yourself. The world is the story. This one actually tried to tell a story with four heroes trying to save the world by defeating evil fiends, restoring light to the spheres. Granted, it was incredibly basic, however, it was one of the firsts, and it was very interesting for that time period. Honestly, though, you're not missing too much if you skip it. Everything that's been done in Final Fantasy has been redone in future games and been done better. That being said, I do recommend, if nothing else, checking out the soundtrack, because Nobuo Uematsu's score survives the test of time. Even the 8-bit version is a joy to listen to. Now, that being said, things changed significantly in the second Final Fantasy. We'll get to that in a minute, but I want you to pay attention, because there are some patterns that are going to develop. Patterns amongst the older Final Fantasies, and patterns amongst the new ones. So, stay tuned. I'll be back with Final Fantasy II in just a second.